I'm truly honored to be with you today. This is not my first time with Los Ranchos Presbytery. About 5.5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, I came to join the celebration for the ordination of Adel Malik. It wasn't in this church, I don't think. I think it was maybe Church of the Master. But anyway, I'm very happy to be with you, and I'm delighted that you've given me this time to talk about a place where I left my heart the last time I was there, Syria. It was without saying that it is an enormous and unfortunate humanitarian crisis. So, I believe the church should speak to the issue or should respond, and the church has been. So, without any further introduction, I'm going to jump quickly into my outline. I'm planning to speak on these 4 issues. Now, I do have a screen in front of me, but it's too far, I can't see it, so occasionally I'll turn around to see what's here. I'll give a very brief background to what Syria was like before 2011, when the current crisis started. Also, a quick introduction to the Presbyterian connection with Syria. And then we'll spend some time talking about the nature of the current crisis, how it came about, and what's happening now. And finally, some of the work of the churches in Syria and what they're doing. I'm hoping to do all of that in half an hour or less so that we have time for question and answer. Okay, so Syria before the conflict was indeed and still is a beautiful country. The first thing when I ask Syrians, what would you like people to know about Syria when I go back to the United States, what do you want me to say? They always want you to know that it's a beautiful country with a lot of culture, and it's in many ways a modern country, a developing country, yes, but has done a lot of progress in the last couple of decades in becoming more and more a modern country. It's also a country with ancient history and phenomenal culture. You, of course, read about it in the Old Testament, in particular, the Assyrian Empire and Damascus. I don't know, was mentioned in the Bible some 30 times. But this is modern Syria today. The borders of Syria were not always like that. The borders, of course, throughout history took different shapes and different forms. But this is how the colonial powers, when England and France ended their colonial occupation of the Middle East in the 1940s and 50s, these were the borders that they made for Syria. And this is the Syrian flag. It's important that I show you this flag now because I will show you opposition flags in just a couple minutes. Syria is a very, very diverse country in terms of its cultural makeup, ethnic makeup, and religious makeup. The largest religious group is the Muslims, but even the Muslims themselves have at least 5 or 6 different subgroups. And then Christians are made up of Orthodox, Catholics, and a variety of Protestants. And then there are smaller ethno-religious groups like the Assyrians, the Armenians, the Kurds, the Turkmen, and not a small number of seculars. The fastest growing religion in the Middle East is atheism, and Syria is no exception. Okay, so before the crisis in 2011, okay, I'm going to ask for help. I hope I didn't do anything wrong. I don't think I have. Okay, before the crisis in 2011, Syria's population was about 22 million. It had a growing economy that shifted recently from socialism to open market economy. But they also maintained universal health care, universal education through college. So people had a lot of benefits that the government was providing and were very happy about it. The majority of Syrians were content. The ruling government, the ruling regime, the Assad regime, came from a background of authoritarian and continued to be so, even though they had opened up to a more democratic style, but remained nevertheless, by Western standards, it remained an authoritarian regime. Now, in 2016, of the 22 million, more than 11 million have been displaced. 5 or so million are refugees outside of Syria, and 6 to 8 million people are displaced within Syria. Of course, it's hard to know exact statistics at this time. All right, we're back in business. Roughly 500,000 Syrians have been killed in the fighting. The economy has been destroyed, the infrastructure has been devastated. To rebuild all of that will take a few decades. All right, the Presbyterian connection goes back to 1823, but that's not when Christianity started in Syria, because if you read the book of Acts, you know that Paul actually was in Damascus, and his sight was restored in Damascus. And if you went to Damascus, you will visit the church that is named after Simon, the disciple who prayed for Paul. So Christianity in Syria goes back to the 1st century, and there are traditional denominations and Protestant denominations. Of course, the traditional denominations are the older ones: Antiochian Orthodox Church, Syriac Orthodox Church, Armenian Catholics, and so on. And Protestant denominations came in the last 2 centuries, the first of whom were the Presbyterians, who came in 1823. When the Presbyterians landed in Beirut, in today's Lebanon, but back then it was part of Greater Syria, they established the American Mission in Beirut. For whatever reason, they did not call it the Presbyterian Mission, they called it the American Mission. And likewise, also, they started a number of schools, a few hospitals, and the American University in Beirut. It is now completely secular, but it was started by Presbyterian missionaries. They established a number of schools. This is, I took this picture of the cross and the dedication above the entrance to the Presbyterian Church in Damascus. And it was established, as the sign says, in 1866. Today, the Synod of Syria and Lebanon has about 40 congregations, half of them in Lebanon and the other half in Syria. They also run 6 schools, and local congregations have a variety of other ministries as well. All right. We Presbyterians have changed how we do mission since the beginning of the 19th century. More recently, we changed our missiology. The General Assembly approved a statement saying that Presbyterians do mission in partnership. As members of the body of Christ, we do mission in partnership with members of the body of Christ all over the world. So in this case, we partner with all Christians in the Middle East and in Syria and Lebanon, but particularly with the Synod of Syria and Lebanon. This is the congregation in Damascus. These are a few folks from the congregation in Homs, and even though they look nice in the pictures, but their environment and their life has been turned upside down in the last 5 years. We still have mission workers serving in Syria and Lebanon, El Marie and Scott Parkers, and I'm sure Tim may have told you about them, and if not, I'm sure he will be telling you more about them, but they live in Lebanon and they visit Syria quite often. Tim just told you about a network of the presbytery that you're all planning to start here, but on the denominational level, also Tim mentioned the Syria-Lebanon Partnership Network. This would be a great resource for Presbyterians today to learn about what's happening in Syria, and particularly what the churches are doing in Syria. All right, the conflict. You hear about it in the news daily, if you check the news daily. The immediate background of the conflict goes to the beginning of the Arab Spring. Of course, there are a lot of other factors that have contributed to the Arab Springs, and I'll touch a little bit on that. But the conflict itself started with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started in Tunis at the end of 2010. Within a couple of weeks, it spread to Egypt. And then within weeks, it had basically permeated all countries in the Middle East, except for one country, except for Syria. For 2 months, Syria was quiet, and the Arab Spring did not materialize. There were no protests, and everybody was waiting. When will protests start in the Arab Spring, in Syria? So not only Western powers were waiting for something to happen in Syria, not only Syrians themselves, but also radicals outside of Syria and radicals in Syria were waiting for the first protests, because this would, of course, provide them with an opportunity to accomplish what they want. So eventually, protests started in March of 2011, and they were largely peaceful protests. Small groups, secular, intellectuals, liberals. And the Syrian government responded foolishly. They responded brutally for the most part, even though they also promised reforms. But the response was not wise. Nevertheless, within a couple of weeks, there were a lot of support to Assad as well on the streets. So the marches in support of Assad were almost as large as the ones in opposition of the Assad regime. But within 2 to 3 weeks, no more than a month, the peaceful protests turned into violent, an opportunity for violent groups to infiltrate and take over. And indeed, the peaceful demonstrations were hijacked by the extremists. Neighboring Iraq was still going through the turmoil that started in 2003 with the invasion by the United States and allies. And radicals had been gathering and organizing and planning in Iraq. So when the Arab Spring started, Islamists of a variety of groups, but particularly what was known then as the Islamic State in Iraq, they found an opportunity to move into Syria and start havoc in Syria. And when they arrived in Syria, they changed their name from the Islamic State in Iraq to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS or ISIL or Daesh. Eventually in 2014, they changed their name to the Islamic State because their intention was to expand outside of the two countries. There were many armed groups within the first months, as I mentioned. So let's go through a few of them. This group, for example, tended to be somewhat secular, and they call themselves the Free Syrian Army. A lot of army defectors joined this group, and they were supported by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United States, and Qatar. They rejected the Syrian flag and established their own flag. So occasionally, but not often, you see this flag now. It's supposed to represent the more moderate, less religious side of the rebellion. But then the majority of the other groups are Islamist in nature, and they actually have the Islamic flag. The Islamic flag has the Islamic confession on it, and usually underneath the Islamic confession, which says God is nobody but God, nobody but Allah is God, and Muhammad is His prophet. That's basically what it says. And then underneath that, it would indicate the name of the specific group. This is another group that also utilizes the Islamic flag. This is another group. This is Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And many of its fighters came from Iraq into Syria early on. And in 2011, 12, and 13, they were known as the most brutal for the way they assassinated their enemies by beheading and so on. Until 2014, when the Islamic State became even more brutal. All right, and there were a few other groups as well. All in all, there were more than 2,000 such groups. The majority of them were Islamics. So to think about them, we need to think of them not as 2,000 groups or today less than 1,000 groups because they've merged together, but to think of them as jihadists or radical Islamists in nature. Again, it's worth mentioning ISIS in particular because ISIS succeeded in swallowing some of the smaller groups, integrating them into its ranks, and recruited thousands of fighters from other countries. So thousands of fighters came from about 80 countries to Syria to fight with the Islamic State. Until 2014, it was estimated that 30,000 from 80 different countries, 30,000 foreign fighters who were not Syrians, but fighting for the agenda of the Islamic State. Okay, so the warring factions in Syria on the ground are the following. The Syrian government and some secular groups, some secular political parties that have joined the Syrian army. They form their own militia and they work in collaboration with the Syrian army. And then the opposition, a majority of Islamists and a smaller group, much smaller group of secular, but really with Sunni Muslim tendencies. The opposition is predominantly Sunni, and the Syrian government supporters are predominantly Shia and secular, and some Sunni who are moderate Sunni. The Christians do not take sides, but they are not tolerated very much by the rebels or the opposition, so they are more lumped with the Syrian regime side. And then there are ethnic groups, particularly the Kurds in the north, who have their own interests and would like to establish an independent or at least semi-autonomous state, as in Iraq, that would be maybe Syrian Kurdistan or something like that. Other smaller ethnic groups like the Turkmen take different sides depending on their own interests at different times. So those, if you will, just the three larger lumps of the warring factions. Now, foreign interests and foreign interference is completely different. So on the one hand, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, all majority Sunni states, have an agenda in Syria. They have not been friendly with the Assad regime. There has been some animosity, even though never fighting. And it was in their interest, at least they perceived in their interest, to oust the Assad regime and replace it with a Sunni regime. So they're supporting the rebels, and including the Islamists. The United States sided with Saudi Arabia and Turkey early on, and still to be on that side till now. The Assad regime's allies came to his aid not quickly, but later on, much later on. And those are Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, is in Lebanon. Russia has a particular interest in Syria, and that is because Russia has a military base in Syria. It is the only military base that Russia now has outside of Russia itself. All the former military bases that the Soviet Union had have been dismantled, and they no longer exist, except for the one military base in Syria. So Syria was not about to let that military base go easily. It's also in the interest of the United States, of course, that that military base goes away. And for that to happen, then the Assad regime has to go. So, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States are supporting the rebels and the Islamists, the opposition, while Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah are supporting the Assad regime. We should mention Iraq, so I put the Iraq flag there. Iraq, of course, is to the east of Syria, because a lot of the fighting that happened in Iraq spilled over into Syria, and then later on the fighting from Syria is spilled back into Iraq, and the Islamic State exists in both places, so Iraq is very much part of the picture. But I don't want to complicate it too much, except to say that the United States is supporting Sunnis in Syria and Shiites in Iraq. the map of who supports who is quite complicated, and we don't have time to get into that. So really what we have now in Syria is not just Syrians against Syrians. It is a proxy war, and it actually has been described as a mini world war, because there are a lot of foreign interests and foreign interference that is now manifesting itself inside Syria. Friends, as I will say again later, a proxy war is never a just war. So, all right. Today, whether we like it or not, the majority of the population in Syria, especially the ones that are remaining in Syria, choose the Assad regime. Those that were opposed to the Assad regime before today say that we'd rather have the stability of the Assad regime than the anarchy that we have now. Enough bloodshed, enough destruction. He's the only one now that can bring about some form of stability. Political parties that are extremely at odds with the Ba'ath Party, the party of the Assad regime, have now joined hands with and joined forces with the Assad regime. So the majority of Syrians, whether we like it or not, whether Barack Obama or President-elect Trump like it or not, this is what the Syrian people want. Okay, who's functioning where? The map, and I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but ISIS still occupies a large territory. Kurds in the north control a significant portion of the north. The secular opposition, there it is, controls a very tiny part here. And again, I say this with qualification, it's not fully secular. They're moderate Sunni, or less radical Sunni. And then, of course, the Al-Qaeda affiliates are here and here. The Islamic State is also down here. And to the east, of course, in Iraq, is the fighting with ISIS. And from the air, the United States and its allies are bombing, and Russia is bombing different targets. The result looks like this. The destruction in Syria is worse by far from any destruction in any European city during World War II. Some people still have to make a living, even in the midst of destruction. When I saw this picture, I did not know if I should cry or rejoice, but people are trying to survive. This is a group of Christians who were displaced back in 2012 and gathered at a church in Fayrouzeh. This is another group of Christians who also were displaced in 2012 and gathered in a different place in Syria in a city called Yazdiya. This is one of the most famous pictures of refugees dying along the way. And this child's life has been probably the price for bringing attention to the plight of refugees. But nevertheless, it's still very tragic. Causes of the conflict. People were, in fact, rebelling against an authoritarian regime that has ruled Syria since the end of colonialism, since the end of World War II. Ethnic and ideological divisions are very much part of that as well. The chaos and instability in Iraq that was started, and actually in the region, not only in Iraq, that was started by the 2003, has definitely been a factor and increased the number of radicals in the region who later on spilled into Syria. Regional struggle, as I mentioned, between the Shiite camp and the Sunni camp, struggle between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. Foreign interests, the United States versus Russia. And all of this had an opportunity when the Arab Spring started, and it erupted when the Arab Spring started. So friends, I think it's appropriate for us to pay particular attention to the role of the United States. Not that the United States is the most guilty party by far. No, that's not what I'm trying to say. But I think it would be less relevant for us if I were to spend time focusing on the role of Saudi Arabia or Russia or Iran. So I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the role of the United States in all of this. because past and present actions of the United States government have contributed significantly to the creation of the conditions that led to this humanitarian disaster. Direct and indirect supply of weapons, past and present, of course, was only adding fuel to the fire that was started there. And often all of this is said to be done by our government in the name of national interests or for protecting our way of life. Whether that is true or not, you can judge that for yourself. I frankly don't think it's true. Taking the long view of when the United States started to really be a major player in the Middle East, so a little bit of a quick background. Back in 1919, the United States was a favorite of all Middle Easterners. When colonial powers, England and France, were ruling the Middle East, President Woodrow Wilson declared that people have the right for self-determination. So throughout the Middle East, protests against colonialism, people were shouting, "Long live the United States, long live Wilson." Unfortunately, that didn't last for very long, because a year later, Wilson, in what historians call the Wilsonian moment, sided with colonial powers. England and France pleaded with him that these countries cannot rule themselves, so you ought to support a protectorate system. Under a little bit of diplomatic pressure, Wilson sided with colonial powers and disappointed not only Middle Easterners, but also Chinese and other countries that were under colonialism. So, and then the United States, by the end of World War II, emerged as a superpower and has its own interests. For example, 1948 in particular, when the United States backed and supported the creation of the State of Israel against the wishes of the region, that was in the interests of the superpower perhaps, but not of the region. And then the Cold War. The Soviet Union overtured the United States early on to say, let's leave the Middle East as a neutral zone. Neither side of the Soviet Union or the West would fight in the Middle East. However, President Eisenhower declined that offer and felt that the Middle East is not something he wanted to leave neutral. So as early as 1949, the CIA, 1 year after the establishment of the CIA backed a military coup in Syria and resulted, of course, in the overthrow of a democratically elected president in Syria, because he was socialist in orientation, and therefore he was too close to the Soviet Union's interests. And 4 years later, the same scenario took place in Iran, where the United States and the military coup in Iran, of course, the CIA played even a more major role. It can't even be argued that without the CIA, that coup in Iran wouldn't have taken place. You're all familiar, of course, with the Iran-Iraq wars. The United States backed Iraq. The Soviet Union backed Iran in the 1980s. So the United States found an ally in Saddam Hussein. But later on, 3 more wars in Iraq, allying with, and the United States, and I'm going through these points very fast, so I'm not pausing between the points, I'm sorry. Whenever convenient for the United States, whenever in the interest of the United States allied with autocratic regimes, regardless of how these regimes treated their people. Economic interest in the United States is a very important factor. I'll try to come to that later if we have time. In short, the Middle East provides for lucrative markets for American corporations, especially the military industry, and companies such as Halliburton. You all know that Halliburton made billions of dollars as a result of the Iraq War. The latest involvement of the United States in the Middle East, of course, is in the proxy war in Syria, and its tug of war against Russia in Syria. So here's a cartoon that kind of explains it a little bit. US politicians, not only Barack Obama, would say we side with freedom in the Middle East, except when it's against our interests, whatever those interests are, whether they're just or unjust, legitimate or not. I'm going to go through a few slides just to show you some of the ways the United States has been involved recently or in the past in the Middle East. So, again, in 1983, Donald Rumsfeld represented Ronald Reagan in providing and facilitating chemical weapons, among other forms of support, to Saddam Hussein's war against Iran. This is a book that was published recently explaining how the United States policy and alliance with the autocratic regime of Hosni Mubarak basically was preventive of democracy in Egypt. The picture at the bottom is one of the protesters during the Arab Spring holding a sign saying, "America, support the people, not the tyrant." While doing research for another presentation last month, I came across this list, this Wikipedia article, which has a list of authoritarian regimes supported by the United States. Of course, the list actually is below this page. So currently, the United States is supporting or collaborating with allies with about 20 dictatorial regimes in the world. The list of previous such alliances is much, much longer. If you're interested in reading more about the coup in Iran that was backed by the CIA in 1953, there are a number of books. Those would be two. And likewise, if you are interested in reading about the United States' role in Israel-Palestine, those would be good books to read. Okay. 2006, when the United States found itself in major problems in Iraq, the shock and awe campaign in Iraq that was expected to last for 3 weeks had by that point lasted for 3 years, and things were getting worse. So the George W. Bush administration said that we're going to implement creative chaos in the Middle East. This was a phrase coined by Condoleezza Rice, and by that she meant basically we're going to dismantle whatever systems that are there now and help a new order in the Middle East. Their intention is to transform the Middle East into a new, more friendly Middle East. As a Middle Easterner, and I hear it all the time from Middle Easterners, we would say, what gives you the right to even think that you can come into a country or into a region and implement any changes, let alone creative chaos? Well, chaos, they did implement. Creativity, none. Okay, so in 2011, the Obama administration declared its opposition to the Assad regime and said Assad must go. As a matter of policy, Assad must go. It may or may not have been in the interest of the United States or a policy of the United States, but at a minimum, this is what the U.S. allies in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey wanted, and the United States backed this goal, this agenda, and it has been and still is until now the Obama administration's policy vis-a-vis Syria is that the Assad regime must go. Okay. Reasons why the United States said the Assad regime must go is that the Syrian regime has always been closer to Russia and more friendly with Russia than the United States. As I mentioned, diplomatic support of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar. Military support to rebels. I don't know how much you know about how much military and intelligence support the United States has been providing to the rebels. We covered all of this. So, economic interests of the United States can be represented by this cartoon. Not only the military industry that benefits from that, but more than any other industry, the military industry of the United States profits billions of dollars every year from sales to countries such as Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and so on. That is not to be confused with U.S. aid to Egypt and Israel. U.S. to Egypt and Israel is about $1 billion to Egypt and $3 billion to Israel every year of military aid. This is, of course, this means profit to the military industry, but taxpayers pay for that, not Egypt or Israel in this case. But the more you export weapons, the more you create refugees and disaster for human beings. Okay, so this is a quote from former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia who served during the Kuwait Liberation War in 1991 and later on as Secretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary of Defense. Americans are in denial about the significant role we have played in destabilizing and immiserating Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. We accept no responsibility for the 450,000 or more Syrian dead or the 11 million displaced from their homes. Our politicians and public oppose taking in refugees from the anarchy we continue to help foster. Jimmy Carter wrote two good op-eds in the New York Times in the last 10 months. These two op-eds would be worth reading, actually. This man is still trying to be a peacemaker and propose practical ideas for ending conflicts. He says the needed concessions are not from the combatants in Syria, but from the proud nations that claim to want peace but refuse to cooperate with one another. So this is from his op-ed in February 2016, New York Times. Okay. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to focus on what churches in Syria and Lebanon and Iraq have been doing in response to this humanitarian disaster. So I'll begin with the Presbyterian Church in Yazdiya, where actually Tim McCalmont and I visited last year. So you see Tim here visiting with Reverend and Mrs. Boros. Reverend Boros is the pastor of the Yazdiya church. He was about to retire at the age of 70 when the Arab Spring started and the conflict started, and he decided he couldn't leave his congregants and his church in this situation because there's a shortage of pastors. If he left, there would be no replacement for him. So he continues to serve today at the age of about 75. I showed you this picture earlier as a group of Christians displaced from Homs near Yazdiya. So in 2012, all of a sudden, this small, tiny, little church in a village in Syria discovered that there were hundreds of thousands of displaced Syrians, many of whom were Presbyterians from the Presbyterian church in Homs. So they went and visited the individuals wherever they found them in camps, or they've rented one room here and one room there, planned meetings for them to bring them together to facilitate distribution of goods and so on. Huda Bos, the wife of the pastor, has become really the engine behind an enormous relief operation done in the basement of the church and in her living room. She invites them to her house. She goes to visit them wherever they are. She plans Sunday school meetings for kids and activities for kids and so on. This is the basement of the church where they've bought and packaged heaters for these displaced families because winter in Syria can be quite cold. The Presbyterian church in Qamishli in northeast Syria is in a very different situation, but equally horrendous. When in 2014 the Islamic State swept through large parts of Syria, and a number of Yazidis from Iraq and Syria ended up living in the desert next to this church, not far from this church, and they needed water. So the church was able to secure grants to dig a well to provide water for the Yazidis. It's not necessarily clean water, but at least it sustained their lives. And they also distribute relief material as much as they can. Meanwhile, the pastor and the elders have to continue the ministry of the church to the church own members and to the displaced people in their area. The city of Homs was under siege and brutal fighting for about 2.5 years, from early 2012 until mid-2014. This young pastor had just been appointed to the church in Homs. But even after most of his 200-member congregation left and only a handful of congregants remained, he decided to remain. He sent his wife and baby child to Damascus to stay with her parents, and he remained behind. I spent a couple of days with him, just shadowing him wherever he went, and asked him to describe to me how he survived during those 2.5 years. I don't have time to tell you some of those stories, but he's quite my hero. This is a family of displaced people that returned to Homs after the siege had ended and the fighting between the government and rebels ended, and people started to return to a destroyed city, and they started to rebuild their homes. Now the church in Homs has about half of its initial membership returned to the city. Some have immigrated already, others are still displaced because they have no place to come back to. But with half of its members, they reach out to the community with what they call Space for Hope. And this is a space inside the church. They plan programs for youth and young adults to come and socialize and play to get their frustration out and deal with their emotional trauma. Meanwhile, also, the Presbyterian Church in Homs runs a K-12 school. That school used to have an enrollment of about 1,500 students. It's now about 700. During the worst fighting, the enrollment had gone down to a little over 200. So many ministries the Presbyterian Church Homs is doing to reach out to its community and to serve its community. While we were walking down the streets of the old city in Homs, we encountered this Catholic priest. Reverend Mufid from the Presbyterian Church introduced me to him. Well, the Catholic priest's church building has been totally destroyed. There is nothing for him to use to gather his congregants or to do his ministry. So he has a little desk, as you see, a chalkboard, and a chair, and sits in front of his destroyed church building. The church building is behind me as I took this picture. Well, on the chalkboard, he wrote a verse. This happened to be from Luke chapter 3. But every few hours, or whenever he feels like it, he would put on a different verse. And he sits there and talks with people and ministers to people as they come by or as they walk down the street. He visits those who have returned, the traumatized. This is his ministry now. This is a family that was displaced also and was helped by the church to find housing. Of course, the father has lost his job, so without church support, they wouldn't have survived. And they made sure to come and tell me, please go and tell the story of how the Presbyterian Church has ministered to us. They are of Assyrian background, they're not Presbyterian. The Presbyterian churches in Lebanon have a different kind of ministry now, because Lebanon has a population of about 4 million people, but more than 1.5 million Syrian refugees have come into Lebanon. All the children refugees do not have schools, so churches in Lebanon have started to implement schools for these children. So a few pictures from different schools by churches in Lebanon to help these students, these kids, not lose time without education. The situation is similar in Iraq. When ISIS swept through northern and eastern Iraq, and a couple of million Iraqis became internally displaced, Iraqi churches had to respond to that, of course. So when I was there in September 2014, I saw how churches were responding to those fleeing from ISIS. So I did not take this picture, but this is a picture of people who fled on foot and arrived at a Catholic church, and that church could do nothing for them. The first day, there were a few hundred people at its door, so the priest just opened the door and said, use the sanctuary to spend the night. Over time, I took this picture from the hotel we were staying. The church had a big yard. All of this was converted to a camp, basically. You see the tents down here, all in the churchyard. And here are the tenants of the tents, the residents of the refugee camp. The Presbyterian Church in Kirkuk, likewise, received a number of people who came to its door overnight, and within a couple of days, the Presbyterian Church was housing 64 families in its Sunday school facilities and its sanctuary and so on. And these are some of the families that we met that were now residents of the Presbyterian Church in Kirkuk, Iraq. This is another family that was not in Kirkuk but ministered to by the Presbyterian Church in Kirkuk. They were displaced in northern Iraq, a couple of 100 miles away from the church. But the church elders were making, and the pastor is in the red shirt, made these regular trips to distribute support to displaced families. So this family of 4 was displaced from the area around Mosul. They're probably still living where they are in northern Iraq and hoping that one day they will be able to go back to their homes. Another refugee camp, but this one is in the desert, and all Sunni Muslims who were persecuted by the Sunni Muslim Islamic State or ISIS. This is a quick look at the response of churches in the Middle East. I'm hoping that in my second presentation, I will be able to talk a little bit about what U.S. churches can do in response. I've taken longer than I wanted. I don't know if we still have time for a bit of discussion. If there are any comments or questions, I'll be happy to.
What do you think the United States should do?
The United States government? Okay, so governments will always pursue their interests, whatever that is. And government will always be manipulated by lobbyists and special interests. So it would be naive for the church to think that the United States has the interest of justice and human rights in foreign countries. So rather than asking what should the United States do, I would like to suggest that we think in terms of what should we advocate the United States to do. So, and I'll mention a few things in my second presentation. I don't mind sharing them now. The United States need to completely change its policies vis-a-vis the Middle East. That's a bit of a pie in the sky, but the church cannot not advocate for more just policies. At a minimum, what our partners in Syria and throughout the Middle East say, and I agree, that the United States should stop immediately providing any support to the rebels and the radicals in Syria. The United States can take some immediate independent initiatives without reaching agreement with Russia, without reaching agreement with other parties. You can start with an independent initiative to reduce the tension. Say, okay, we will not support the rebels, and we are going to ask the rebels to stop the fighting. And so the United States can take a number of steps by way of, again, independent initiatives. And Russia really joined the fighting much, much later than the United States. Russia's direct involvement started in September 2015, just a little over a year ago. The United States was involved in supporting rebels much, much earlier. The Assad regime almost collapsed, and everybody was waiting for just, people were saying it's a matter of weeks before the Assad regime collapsed. Of course, Russia continued to provide minimal support, but the Assad regime would have disappeared if Russia hadn't stepped in to protect its own interest. Russia's not interested in the Syrian people either. Russia's foreign policy is much more immoral, much less moral than the United States. But if it weren't for Russia's involvement is for the most part a reaction to the United States involvement. Yes.
Reliable news sources. I follow the network's Facebook page, and they're constantly correcting the news stories. Even NPR is getting the stories wrong about, they'll say it was Assad who bombed, and it turns out it was actually ISIS who bombed. What reliable news sources are there that's really telling the story?
You must be a discerning and an intelligent consumer of news. There is no solution to, yes, you don't believe everything you hear on Fox News or NBC or CNN about what you hear about what's happening in the United States. Because you are an informed and an intelligent and a discerning citizen, you are able to filter the information, the news items that you receive, and decide for yourself what's to believe and what's not to believe. So, news from the Middle East, if we want to be responsible, or if you feel called to be an active Christian vis-a-vis the Middle East, you're going to have to become more informed and therefore become a discerning consumer of news. But to answer your question, some news items are better than others. Most U.S. news, unfortunately, do not have the best reporting. That is partly an economic factor because they cannot have a lot of reporters on the ground in Syria, so they purchase and they contract with second-hand news items. It is amazing to me how many times I heard about the news of what's happening in Syria, reporting from Jerusalem, so-and-so is giving me a report. How can you know what's happening in Syria if you're reporting from an enemy country in Jerusalem? How do you get first-hand news from Jerusalem? But it's just because it's in the Middle East, am I supposed to take this report as authentic report? Or, if it's less offensive, is when they report from Beirut. But still, you're in Beirut. So where do you get your reports from? So very few news sources actually have people on the ground in Syria. And even then, there's hardly a news agency or a reporter that does not have an agenda of some sort. If I were to report news myself, I have my bias. My bias would be pro-church bias, maybe. My Christian lens, maybe. So, sorry, I do not have a good or a simple answer to that question. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Kelly. I have relatives in Kamishli, and I have relatives in Damascus. I'm asking, what rule of faith do we use to determine who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in this whole crisis? I've been asked to support the Assyrians, and I'm Assyrian, in providing funds for guns so they can fight ISIS. And they were not given guns. What is our role as Christians in this country in this whole crisis?
Unfortunately, I will comment about the Assyrians asking for arms. Unfortunately, a few Christian groups, but to my knowledge, not Christian churches, but a few Christian groups have decided to pick up arms and fight against the Islamic State and in some cases against the opposition as a whole, and they, for the most part, sided with the Assad regime like other political parties have. So yes, there has been a few Assyrians and a few non-Assyrian Christians who've decided to do that. I cannot do that. I cannot condone that. I cannot support that. At the same time, who am I to judge them? Because I don't know what I would do if I were in their situation. I will talk a little bit more about this again in my 10-minute presentation and later on. But what comes to my mind is, and I don't know why this came to my mind now, is Paul's letter to the Philippians, I think chapter 3, where he says, "But our citizenship is from heaven, from where we expect a Savior. The Savior for U.S. policy will not be Donald Trump. It wouldn't have been Hillary Clinton. The Savior for poverty in the United States would not have been either one. But as Christians, I would argue that our role, first and foremost, is being witnesses to the love of God in our context and throughout the world. And of course, interpreting that in this context is not easy. It's actually been quite difficult, and I haven't found too many articles or presentations given about that. Briefly, let me say this. And I'm giving a short summary of what I will say later on. The beginning point is to partner with the faithful Christians remaining there. Secondly, is to really, truly, and deeply understand what's going on there so that you can help your congregations be faithful Christians. If your congregations have, and your congregants have questionable information, as we all do, from the media, and they have no choice but to believe what they're told, they may side with the U.S. government. They may, unfortunately, believe that the U.S. government is on the right side of things here. That would be disastrous, in fact, if Christians in this country were to support the U.S. actions in Syria. So you have to take the time to understand what's going on. And then you educate your congregation. And then you advocate for justice, for human rights, and for a little bit more fair policies by the United States. Folks, sending money is the least important thing. Yes, there is a humanitarian disaster over there, but frankly, all the wealth of the Presbyterian Church, the denomination as a whole, would be a drop in the bucket in Syria today. The need there is enormous. So yes, try to help with the humanitarian crisis because people need it. But I'm also reminded when the rich young man, and we in this country are rich folks, the rich young man went to Jesus and said, "What must I do to inherit the kingdom of God?" Or he said, did he say, "Follow me and I will give your money to the poor"? Or did he say, "Give your money to the poor, and when you're poor, come and follow me"? Jesus can do a lot of things with faithful Christians, and more so, frankly, if we do not have the economic resources that we think can solve the problem. We're bogged as American Christians, rich, privileged, powerful Christians. We are not able to do mission as much as we could because we're distracted by our resources and our privilege. That's my opinion on this. That may be controversial. Yes, sir.
I've always been aware of what happened in Iran in 1953. I have not been aware of the CIA's involvement in Syria in 1949. In fact, I don't think they admitted that for a while.
They haven't admitted it yet.
I'm very interested in your comment about in the early you know, we're just little, and we're dealing with two, you know, large countries, but is there any hope that those talks might yield something good? That's my question.
The alternative to hope in this case is to give in to potential even greater humanitarian disaster. So, yes, let's continue to hope. The odds of Russia and the United States reaching an agreement are really hard to judge. Of course, with a new administration, things are changing, and it may be possible that Russia and the United States will reach an agreement. But again, as I said earlier, we can lobby the United States government to take independent initiatives before reaching an agreement with Russia. Neither country is more righteous than the other. But yes, we should hope. I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer, because if I were to say the reality is bleak, well, the reality is bleak. Thank you.